we can get that taken care of for you guys. So the first thing in Final Cut Pro 10, one of the big changes is the way that files are actually organized. And when you open up Final Cut for the first time, you're going to see this untitled library. So all of the video you edit with, pictures, music, whatever you're going to use to create your project, it's going to show up inside of this untitled library. And the libraries are very important because everything gets connected to them. You can definitely have multiple libraries. You can just go up to File, New, and create a new library. And then you'll get an option to name this library. So I'm just going to call this snowboarding. So we got some snowboarding clips we're going to work with here. I'm going to put this on the desktop so you can see what this looks like. And when I save this, you'll notice up here on the desktop we have this untitled library, which you can see on the left column here, untitled. And now we have a snowboarding library as well. Both of them look exactly the same. They have some smart collections, and they have an event titled with today's date. So that's what a library is. You can rename libraries, either here inside of Final Cut or from the Finder if it's on the desktop or somewhere else. If I update the name on here, we'll just call this one Test. Once Final Cut gets updated, you'll see that name reflects here. And same thing, you can select it here, just click on it, and then put in another name here. So we'll just call this one Apple, and then the Apple shows up on the desktop as well. You can close a library. Since we have two open, we don't necessarily need both of these open, just by going to File and then choosing Close Library. Once a library is closed, you can go up and open it from the Open Library menu, either as a recent library, or you can go back and just choose Other and browse for it. So that's a library, and when you select the library on the left column, you're going to see on the right side, the inspector, we see all the properties for that library. If for any reason you don't see this window, it's just this button up at the top right. You can press that to show it. Or if you've rearranged all these windows somehow, just press Command 0, and that'll give you the default layout of Final Cut Pro 10. I try to do almost every single one of my videos in the defaults, both in the layouts and any other commands that are kind of shipping with Final Cut. That way you don't have to search around for how things look. But if you do customize your keyboard, if you create custom shortcuts, or you have other physical devices connected to your Mac to control it, some of these shortcuts may be different for you. But in my case, Command 0 is the default workspace or window layout, and so that's where we get this layout. But anyway, with a library selected, we're going to select this snowboarding library. On the right side, we have some library properties. A lot of new editors don't use these properties because they're not necessarily something you're gonna need early on, but they're good know about that they are there. So if you do need to move some footage around or customize things, you can do that. So the first thing, the biggest things are these storage locations. If you click on this, this lets you change where content is actually going to be stored. On the desktop back here, we have this Apple library and a snowboarding library. So in a minute, I'm going to import some video into the snowboarding library. And when I do that, right now it says to store that media in the library. So it's actually going to copy all of those clips inside of that snowboarding library. I could change this and choose to put it in a different folder. So that's a nice way to be able to manually organize your clips instead of letting Final Cut do it. If you are new to editing video with Final Cut Pro 10 or any advanced editor, I strongly recommend leaving these at the defaults. Then you can get used to it and work with it, and then if you need to manually organize, you can do that later on. If you are more of an advanced editor, definitely don't hesitate. Go in here, change these how you want. You can store all of these different types of files in those different locations. Similar, if you are an advanced editor, you might be editing with content that can take advantage of the wide gamut or HDR video format. And that's what you can change here. I just clicked on the Modify button for this library, and this is going to change everything in this library to work with the wide gamut or HDR footage. And this is great if you're using custom LUTs, if you're recording other content that is in HDR. This can then actually take advantage of it, and Final Cut can use this. This is a newer feature, but definitely a great way. All you would do is select this, change it, and then you're all set. This applies to everything in this library. So in a second, we're going to be talking about events, projects, and all these other ways to organize inside of Final Cut. Everything that's in this snowboarding library, if we were to change this to HDR, would also apply to the HDR settings. For those of you newer to editing, keep this standard. You don't have to worry about it at this point. But if you know that the cameras you're working with can support HDR, then switch it over there. And again, that was from the Modify button. We saw the Modify settings for storage locations, and we can see at the top some basic information about this library, specifically where it's stored, which is on my internal drive right now, so Macintosh HD, and how much space it's taking up. The other things that you can control here in the library properties are the media, motion content, and caches. So with those three, essentially, they're all created automatically, and if you modified where the storage locations are, what Consolidate does is moves those files into the modified locations. So if you wanted to store and import video, let's say this stuff is stored on the desktop, and I modified this setting for the storage location. I chose, instead of in the library, I chose the desktop. What that means is then when I drag the snowboarding video into Final Cut, those clips are just going to stay right here on the desktop, and they're not going to get copied into the snowboarding library. So Consolidate would go through and find any of the clips that are outside the library and bring them inside of Final Cut. So those are some of the settings that are in here. There's also the backup databases, so you can see that, and then other content that's used. So those are the library properties. And again, the library is just kind of the top layer of everything that you do for organization with inside of Final Cut Pro 10. Libraries can be deleted just by dragging them to the trash if you don't need them, or you can just drag this to an external hard drive if you wanted to copy it or move it somewhere else. So that's libraries. Again, if you do have any other questions, you can always pop it into the chat, and I'll try to answer those as we go here. All right, so that's libraries, and then moving on to events, because every time you import, some people think that you import directly